You know that feeling when you're like staring at a suitcase trying to pack for a week-long trip? You just keep shoving things in.
Oh, yeah. You're just sitting on the zipper, wrestling with the fabric.
Exactly. You're just hoping the whole thing doesn't burst open in the middle of the airport.
Mhm.
Well, writing clearly and concisely is, it's basically the intellectual equivalent of being a master packer.
And it's not necessarily about bringing a smaller bag, you know? It's about folding everything so perfectly, engineering the space so well that you can fit twice as much information inside without, well, breaking the zipper of your reader's attention span.
Which is an absolute superpower if you are prepping for the TEAS or HESI nursing entrance exams, or really if you just want to communicate without putting your audience to sleep.
Oh, for sure.
So today's deep dive is all about that. We are unpacking the psychology, the history, and the surprisingly high-stakes reality of saying more with less.
Right. And to pack that intellectual suitcase properly, we first need to define what concise actually means in this context. I mean, it is conveying an idea using the fewest words that preserve full accuracy and meaning. The ultimate goal here is managing cognitive load.
Okay, cognitive load, so making it easier on the brain.
Exactly. When you write concisely, a reader's mental effort goes toward understanding the actual concepts, not, burning energy just trying to decode the structure of the sentence.
That makes total sense. So they're engaging with the ideas rather than fighting through this jungle of vocabulary to figure out who is doing what. But I feel like that pushes back against the biggest misconception out there, the idea that concise simply means short.
It does. That is a massive misconception. A perfect historical illustration of this is the Gettysburg Address in 1863. I mean, Abraham Lincoln wasn't actually the keynote speaker that day.
Wait, really? He wasn't the main event?
Nope. The main speech came from a celebrated orator named Edward Everett, and he spoke for roughly 2 hours.
2 hours. And Lincoln?
Lincoln spoke for about 2 minutes. He delivered exactly 272 words.
2 hours versus 2 minutes. That contrast is just staggering.
Yeah, and Everett actually wrote a letter to Lincoln the very next day, basically admitting defeat. He wrote, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes."
Wow.
The differentiator wasn't just the length. Lincoln didn't just write a shorter speech. He wrote a denser, more perfectly packed speech. Every single word was doing heavy lifting.
Meaning, if you write a single sentence that just omits a crucial detail, it isn't concise, it's just incomplete. You brought the small bag, but you forgot your toothbrush.
Perfect analogy. And we see this play out constantly when government agencies attempt to rewrite their dense bureaucratic regulations into plain language. When they do these plain language rewrites, the new versions are sometimes the exact same length as the old ones. Occasionally, they are actually longer.
That feels completely counterintuitive.
Yeah.
You'd think plain language automatically equals a lower word count.
You would, but usability testing consistently shows people complete tasks faster and more accurately with those plain versions, even if they are slightly longer. Taking the time to fully explain a concept with a bit of necessary redundancy actually aids comprehension.
So cutting words is just a means to clarity, not the end goal itself.
Exactly.
Okay, so if it's not strictly about word count, there must be a biological reason certain paragraphs make my eyes glaze over. We need to look at what physically makes a sentence feel cluttered to the brain in the first place.
It all comes down to human working memory. When a person reads, they can only hold a very small amount of information in their active working memory at once.
So every time a writer throws in an unnecessary clause,
Right, or buries the main subject, or delays the action of the verb, they force the reader to juggle more and more abstract concepts in their head. The sentence structure itself has to carry that cognitive load.
and when the reader inevitably drops those mental juggling balls, they have to go back and reread the entire paragraph, which is just the most frustrating feeling.
It really is. Let's look at how this plays out for a nurse in the ICU. Take this cluttered sentence. The nurse who had just come from a difficult shift in the ICU and who was also covering for a colleague on break administered the medication.
Ugh, yeah, that's a mouthful.
Right. As a reader, I'm holding on to the nurse. Then I have to mentally process the ICU shift. Then I'm processing the colleague on break, all while waiting to find out what this nurse actually did.
You're just waiting for the verb to drop. Now compare that to the revised, concise version. The nurse, tired from a difficult ICU shift and covering for a colleague, administered the medication.
The mechanics of delivery change everything there. The main action, the subject nurse, and the verb administered resolves much faster.
So the reader's working memory can clear out that core action, before it has to attach all the extra descriptive details. It literally gives the brain permission to exhale.
Yes, exactly. And this reminds me of a concept introduced back in 1981 by linguist Joseph M. Williams. He diagnosed exactly why sentences get bogged down like this, calling it nominalization.
Nominalization. That sounds like jargon itself.
It is a bit, but it's a sneaky grammatical habit. Nominalization is when a writer takes a perfectly good active verb and freezes it into a static noun.
Oh, I call them zombie nouns. They just shamble around eating the brains of your sentence.
I love that. They completely drain the momentum. A classic example is writing something like, a decision regarding the implementation of the new charting policy was made by the committee.
Oh, you can feel the life draining out of the room just hearing that.
Because the real action deciding is frozen into the noun decision, and the actual actor, the committee, is buried all the way at the end of the sentence. Williams argued the fix is straightforward. Find the buried verb, revive it, and put the actual actor in the driver's seat.
Right, changing it to, the committee decided to implement the new charting policy. You present the exact same facts, but you've cut the word count by 40% and made it immediately clear who is doing what. You killed the zombie noun.
You did. But this brings up a fascinating tension, because that bloated zombie noun style is often exactly how smart academic writing is expected to sound. I mean, students are constantly conditioned to stretch their word counts to hit a page requirement.
Which creates this illusion that complexity equals intelligence. And that gets right at how the definition of clarity has shifted over the last 100 years, because big words are very often used to hide weak ideas.
They really are. If we look back to 1918, we had a very prescriptive era. An English professor named William Strunk Jr. self-published a pamphlet for his Cornell students called The Elements of Style, which was later expanded by E.B. White.
Strunk's big rule was omit needless words, right?
Right. At the time, clarity was mostly seen as a byproduct of grammatical correctness. It was a protection against the heavily ornate, Latin-influenced writing of the 19th century. The assumption was simply that if you followed strict grammar rules, your writing would naturally be clear.
But then post-World War II, around 1946, the whole conversation shifts from a grammatical issue to a moral and civic issue.
Yes. George Orwell publishes Politics and the English Language. He was reacting to Stalinist euphemisms, British colonial reports, and just general bureaucratic doublespeak.
Orwell saw jargon as a weapon, didn't he?
He did. He pointed out how governments use language to deliberately obscure reality. For instance, calling the bombing of a defenseless village pacification.
Pacification. Wow. The word sounds peaceful, clinical, almost helpful.
Exactly. It completely masks the violent reality of the action.
Here's where it gets really interesting for you as a listener. Orwell wasn't just annoyed by jargon. He believed unclear writing was a defense mechanism for propaganda. His rules, like never use a long word where a short one will do, were tools for exposing dishonest thinking.
It completely dismantles the idea that simple words mean you're unsophisticated.
Yes, jargon is a verbal smoke grenade. A genuinely rigorous thinker uses simple words because they have nothing to hide. Simple does not mean dumb.
Absolutely. And around that same time, Rudolf Flesch was tackling this from a mathematical angle. He was so frustrated by academic and corporate jargon that he developed formulas based on sentence length and syllable count to objectively measure clarity.
And in 1975, the U.S. Navy actually contracted Flesch and his colleague J. Peter Kincaid to adapt this formula, right?
Right.
They needed to guarantee that Navy training manuals could be easily understood by enlisted personnel reading at various grade levels.
That's right. They created the Flesch-Kincaid grade level score, and that exact Navy formula is now baked directly into the readability checker in Microsoft Word.
Which is crazy. Millions of people use it every single day to check their emails and essays, completely unaware it was designed for mid-century naval training.
Yeah, it's wild. But it raises an issue. If we've got Orwell arguing that hiding behind big words is a moral failing, and the Navy giving us mathematical formulas for plain talk.
Does that mean a low/Kincaid score guarantees your essay is clear? Like, are these rigid rules always the ultimate truth?
Not at all. Readability formulas have serious limitations. They are only proxies for difficulty. They only measure surface complexity, sentence length, and syllable count. They aren't actually reading the text for logic.
So I could write A sequence of incredibly short, choppy sentences with absolutely no logical connection to one another, and the formula calls it an easy read.
Right, while a human being finds it completely confusing due to the lack of coherent organization. Conversely, a highly lucid, brilliantly argued article in a cardiology journal will score as hard simply because medical terminology has a lot of syllable.
But to its intended audience of cardiologists, it's perfectly clear.
Exactly. The formula is completely blind to context, and rigidly adhering to these rules has created a huge backlash. In 2009, linguist Jeffrey Pullum wrote a blistering critique called 50 Years of Stupid Grammar Advice, aimed directly at Strunk and White.
Pullum argued that many of these classic rules are just the personal stylistic preferences of a couple of guys in the mid-20th century, dressed up as unbreakable grammatical laws, right?
Yes. And enforcing them so rigidly just creates generations of writers who are deeply and unnecessarily anxious about their prose.
Which leads us to a massive misconception, especially for nursing students prepping for those entrance exams. The idea that you must always avoid the passive voice. Active voice is the nurse administered the medication. Passive voice is the medication was administered. The action happens to the subject.
So passive voice is probably the most demonized grammatical construction in English, but it's a tool, not a sin. In many forms of professional writing, particularly clinical documentation in nursing, the passive voice is exactly what you want to use.
Like charting, the patient was found unresponsive at 0630. That is a passive construction, but it is perfectly correct.
Because the identity of the person who found the patient isn't the most vital piece of information in that emergency. The patient's condition is the point. You are deliberately shifting the emphasis to the patient.
But where the passive voice becomes dangerous, echoing Orwell's warning, is when it is used to deliberately obscure accountability.
Right. The classic political example is the phrase, mistakes were made.
Oh, I hate that phrase. It makes it sound like mistakes just spontaneously generated in a vacuum. Nobody made them, they just happened.
It dodges responsibility entirely. So the rule shouldn't be never use the passive voice. It should be understand what the passive voice does to accountability and use it purposefully.
Rules are tools. You have to know when to use a hammer and when to use a scalpel. But I want to look at what happens when we use the wrong tools in the real world. Outside the classroom, how catastrophic can unclear writing actually get?
It becomes a critical operational safety problem. One of the most studied cases of communication failure in modern history is the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in 1986. The night before the launch, engineers at Morton Thiokol, the contractor responsible for the solid rocket boosters, held an urgent conference call with NASA.
Right, and they warned that the cold weather predicted for the launch morning could cause the rubber O-ring seals to fail.
So they had the data, and their concerns were entirely correct. But when statistician and information design scholar Edward Cufdy later analyzed how that data was presented, he found a tragic failure of clarity.
What did they do wrong?
The engineers presented their findings in incredibly dense, cluttered charts. They failed to construct a clear, concise, causal argument connecting the temperature directly to the O-ring failure. They buried the lead under mountains of poorly organized technical details.
So they gave decision makers all the pieces of the puzzle, but didn't put the picture together for them.
Exactly. The risk simply wasn't made legible to the people who had the actual power to delay the launch. That lack of clear communication contributed directly to the decision to proceed. The shuttle exploded 73 seconds after liftoff, and 7 crew members lost their lives.
It's devastating. It wasn't a lack of scientific knowledge, it was a lack of communicative clarity. And that brings the stakes directly into the clinical environment. Clear writing is quite literally a daily matter of patient safety.
It is. In 2004, the Joint Commission, which accredits U.S. hospitals, issued their famous Do Not Use list of abbreviations. They didn't do this to be pedantic about style. They recognized that ambiguity in medical charting kills people. For example, using the abbreviation U for units.
Oh, because if a doctor hurriedly handwrites 10U for 10 units of insulin, that U can easily be misread by the next person as a 0.
Suddenly, the patient is receiving 100 units instead of 10. That is a massive, life-threatening 10-fold overdose caused entirely by a lack of clarity on the page.
That is terrifying.
They also banned things like QD for once daily and QOD for every other day because they look too similar when written quickly.
This ties into the broader crisis of health literacy, too. According to the U.S. National Assessment of Adult Literacy, only about 1 in 8 American adults is considered proficient in health literacy. The vast majority of patients are highly vulnerable to unclear medical instructions.
Which is why plain language is now a legal standard in many areas, like the Plain Writing Act of 2010. The government recognized that if citizens can't understand federal forms, they miss out on benefits, they are denied claims, and trust in the institution erodes.
And in the nursing field, this demand for clarity is why tools like SBR exist: situation, background, assessment, recommendation.
SBAR is a lifesaver. It is a structured communication tool designed specifically to force nurses and doctors to be concise. During a shift handoff under extreme time pressure, a vague or overloaded note can directly harm the patient on the next shift.
SBR forces you to strip away the clutter and deliver only the high-density information. And for you listeners prepping for your TEAS or HESI exams, this is exactly what the reading and English sections are testing.
Right, they aren't just checking if you memorize grammar rules. They are evaluating if you can spot the main idea buried in a wordy passage, eliminate redundancies, and choose the most concise, accurate rephrasing of a cluttered sentence.
The student who can efficiently process information on a test is the same student who will clearly communicate critical patient data in a chaotic emergency room.
Spot on.
Ultimately, when you sit down to write your next charter essay, you aren't just fighting word count, you are fighting working memory. Writing clearly means maximizing the density of your meaning. It's ditching the zombie nouns, using tools like the passive voice responsibly to emphasize the right subject, and structuring sentences so you don't overload your reader's brain.
You know, building on that strict biological limit of human working memory and the fact that the Plain Writing Act made clear communication a legal standard for the government, it raises an interesting question about the future.
Oh, what's that?
Well, could we one day see a world where everyday consumers can legally challenge massive corporate contracts or tech terms of service agreements, not because they contain fraudulent lies, but simply because the text is engineered to deliberately overwhelm human working memory? If clutter is used as a weapon, could intentionally confusing jargon eventually be classified not just as bad style, but as a genuine psychological violation of the consumer?
Framing a 50-page terms of service agreement as a psychological violation really makes you rethink every I agree button you've ever clicked. Well, it all comes back to that suitcase we talked about at the top of the show. Your reader is carrying your ideas for you. Do him a favor, pack the bag well, fold everything neatly, and whatever you do, save the zipper. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we highly encourage you to take these tools and apply them to whatever you write next. Catch you next time.